Hey, this is Spoonie, and it's time for part 2 of the January update. I originally did not intend to have a part 2. I typically would do just a monthly update during this phase of development because there really isn't enough information to make it worth doing more often than that. So literally 36 hours after I published the video, the developers dropped the first look at rockets in-game, and honestly, I just didn't want to wait a full month before talking about these. We're also going to discuss some rumors about the Kerbal Space Program acquisition, which many people have brought up in the comments from part 1 of the January update. So if you haven't seen part 1, it includes a recap of the December update as well as a look at what the development team has been up to for the second half of December and the first half of January. I will link that in the description below and add a link to it at the end of this video as well. So anyway, on to part 2. Let's jump right in. My first impression upon seeing these images was just, wow. I did not expect the ship to look this good this early. Obviously, we can see a little bit of aliasing, which is to be expected this early, and this definitely isn't the final product, but if this is our first look, this is impressive. They have obviously taken some inspiration from Kerbal parts and blended it with what we've seen from real-world space programs, and this is a huge relief for me personally. I wasn't really sure what direction the developers were going to take with the rocketry. Were they going to focus on hyperrealism, or were they going to lean into a more cartoonish aesthetic to match the kittens? But what they are showing us is a really nice blend and exactly what I would have hoped for. I personally don't want the ships to look too realistic, that the focus then becomes on graphics and high fidelity, but I also don't want them to look too cartoonish to the point where it's hard to take the game seriously. And this is a nice balance. It leans on realism but doesn't take itself too seriously, much like what we got from KSP. I was a little concerned when they mentioned that the ease of development and modding was the major concern when considering the art style, but needless to say, I am no longer concerned. This is what I was hoping to see from Kerbal Space Program 2. A much cleaner version of KSP with better lighting, better physics, bigger ships, and better terrain. And just look how cool the refractions and scattering looks through the atmosphere. These pictures make me think that Kitten Space Agency is going to have a really epic feel when you first arrive at a new planet or moon. It also gives more of a sense of just how huge these planets are. Sometimes in KSP, it felt like the planetary bodies weren't as massive as maybe they should be. And that's something the developers have mentioned that they are focusing on here: the scale, with the orbital bodies and distance between them being something like 2 to 2.5 times what we saw in Kerbal. Something that is much closer to our actual planets and solar scales. Although they said that everything in the game is moddable, so if you want it bigger or smaller, all of that can be easily done. I can't wait to visit some of those giant gigaplanets that people will no doubt mod in. And I'm really trying my best to stay off of the hype train here because those go off the rails all too often. But the more I see from this game, the more excited I am getting for it. I would actually say at this point it's probably the title I am most looking forward to in 2025. And with the developers saying they'd like to get the free version out to us sometime in mid to late 2025, we may not have to wait all that long to try it out. Obviously, we don't know if this ship was just placed here or if it was test launched from the ground, but what this does mean is that patched conics seem to be in place and they are moving on to the asset building phase of development, which is great news as it will probably be a bit less intensive on the maths front. Can we also talk about the Scott Manley asteroid for a second? That is such a great touch to add in shoutouts to people who were so influential in the Kerbal sphere. If you don't know, Scott Manley is a fairly prolific YouTuber who creates a lot of content around Kerbal Space Program and just generally has some really interesting videos on Kerbals and space exploration. So I'm really excited to visit his asteroid. We can also see that the developers have included less known orbital bodies like the Makemake Comet. Although it's not really a comet, it's more of a dwarf planet, but what's really cool about this is it probably means that the Kuiper Belt is included in the game, which is where the Makemake Comet is found. Something Kerbal Space Program didn't really include was an asteroid belt. I know that they later added in asteroids that you can visit that come and go, but a constant ring of ice and rocks would be a really cool thing to visit, especially if it includes the large comets and dwarf planets that our actual Kuiper Belt has. What's also really neat about this is that they can use NASA images to probably add in textures to make them resemble the actual bodies. I've admittedly kind of gone down a rabbit hole now exploring what orbital bodies exist in our real-life solar system that might be large enough to include. We apparently didn't even know that the Makemake Comet was there until 2005, and in 2016, thanks to the Hubble telescope, we discovered that the Makemake Comet also has its own moon. Something I also read on NASA's website about this particular comet is that it is thought to only sometimes have an atmosphere that develops when it's closer to the sun, which then dissipates when it gets further away. This fact, combined with the instantiable physics that we talked about in part 1, could lead to some really cool mechanics. Because everything in the game has its own laws of physics and its own set of rules that aren't affecting everything else unless it's told to, they could, as far as I understand it, fairly easily add in a mechanic where, depending on how far this comet is from the sun, it may have an atmosphere. That atmosphere could then have some level of impact on probes and manned missions that you send out. I really don't know if that's something that they're planning to add, but seeing orbital bodies like this included means that it's starting to look like we are going to have a lot more to explore compared to what we had in Kerbal Space Program. Combine that with the focus on modding that the developers have committed themselves to, and there very well may be an endless number of systems and planets to explore very quickly after launch. But what else have you guys noticed from these images? Let me know down in the comments if I overlooked something, but all in all, they just look great. I love seeing more of the cloud implementation, even if it's still a work in progress, and the lighting on ship parts and planets just look incredible. Along with the new ships, we were also shown a few more images of the Kitten's work-in-progress concepting, where they seem to feel the idea of making the bodies smaller has been taken a bit too far. So the next iteration will be somewhere between this and what we saw in part 1 of the update, with slightly longer extremities and bigger feet and hands, but one thing they are keeping is the gigantic zipper on the front of the outfit. And honestly, that was one thing I felt they should remove. I am not a fan of the gigantic zipper. Are you? Let me know down in the comments, but I sort of hope that doesn't make it into the final product, but I guess it's not a huge deal. Dean Hall also mentions that they want to go with a larger head and smaller body aesthetic because it's easier on development and can allow for emotions to be expressed through facial expressions, but also allows for movements and interactions to be more representative than realistic, similar to what we saw in Kerbal's, I assume. Alright, so moving on to some of the rumors that have been brought up in the comments about Kerbal Space Program and who bought it or might be buying it. It is true, I did overlook something. A few days before I posted the video, we got some new information about what is going on with the Kerbal franchise, so let me elaborate a little bit on what we know and what's just a rumor. Firstly, it's important to point out that from here on out, I'm talking about the entire Private Division collection of titles that was sold at the end of 2024, and not specifically just Kerbal Space Program. But Kerbal Space Program's IP is among the assets that are up in the air. So, Bloomberg and IGN, among several others, have reported that a private investment firm called Haveli Investments is the group that purchased Private Division from Take-Two back in November of 2024. This acquisition, of course, includes the Kerbal IP and supposedly around 20 employees that were kept at Private Division up until the acquisition, although shortly after, many of them were made redundant. In other words, most of them were laid off. This has apparently been confirmed by multiple people, including a reporter at IGN who claims to have personally confirmed this, but didn't elaborate on how specifically or to whom they spoke. It's probably safe to say at this point that despite not having any official announcement from Haveli Investments, they are likely the private equity group that purchased Private Division. Their Wikipedia page shows that they also have a history of investing in gaming studios and publishers, including a minority stake in Behavior Interactive, the studio behind Dead by Daylight. Despite this being reported by Bloomberg and other typically reliable sources, there has been no official statement or press releases regarding this on Haveli Investments' website. So now we're moving on to what is less concrete and what I will for now just call a rumor, because there is still a lot of unanswered questions here. But according to rumors, former staff members from Annapurna Interactive have band together to create a new label. That new label has supposedly worked out a deal with Haveli Investments from which they will distribute titles from Private Division. Which titles is still unknown, and it will most likely focus more on upcoming titles like Project Bloom and Tales of the Shire that are nearer to completion and as of yet untainted by negative reviews and bad press. Again, this is a rumor, and while it's a somewhat substantiated rumor, it's still a rumor. And while it is said that this new label has reached a deal with Haveli Investments, we have no idea what that deal looks like, what's included, who's involved, or what games are going to be worked on, and which ones won't. What we do know is that it was also said that Paradox Games was once close to a deal for those titles before Intercept Games was shut down, and as we now know, that deal fell apart. So nothing's official until it's official. I don't want to doom and gloom about Kerbal Space Program, but I am honestly personally not emboldened by this news. If the news coming out about this was that Kerbal Space Program specifically was being taken up by a new developer or a new label, I might be excited, but that's not what it sounds like. At least not to me. To me, it sounds more like Private Division had a few games under development that were nearing completion, and they are now preparing to finish those titles and distribute them rather than jump right back into developing Kerbal Space Program. I obviously could be wrong, but that's my expectation. Again, nothing is official, and nothing has even been announced by anyone involved, So for now, this is all just rumors. Also, Kerbal Space Program is known to be sort of a hot mess as far as code is concerned. It kind of had to be given the game engine it was using and what needed to be done, but KSP2 was apparently, and ridiculously, built on top of that code rather than starting fresh with newer, more capable engines that are available today. Or even better, building their own framework for the game like Kitten Space Agency has done. Considering they had millions of dollars as a budget, there's no reason they didn't. Jumping into that mess without an experienced team who knows the project would be difficult to say the least. Plus, KSP2 has a lot of issues and took a full year to get their 4 Science update out, even when they still had a fully staffed and dedicated development team. I am just not hopeful that a new team unfamiliar with the project could jump in and finish this game in any reasonable amount of time. I'll make a video with an update on the Kerbal IP once we get something more official and know more about what specifically is going on. Hopefully, we won't have to wait long. Don't forget to hit that like button, it really helps my channel, and if you want to stay up to date on gaming news and developments, make sure you subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.